Hello and welcome to Current Affairs on JTV. Today I'm joined by Sam Chester, who's an expert in relations between China and the Middle East, drawing from a decade of academic and professional experience that includes fieldwork in China and throughout the Middle East. Sam's joining us from China today. Okay, Sam, thanks for joining us. Now, everyone knows that China is a rising power, but nobody knows whether that rise is going to lead to conflict with other powers or to peaceful coexistence. What's your take on that?
I tend to find myself slightly more in the optimist camp. 2015 in China, we saw major market turmoil, and of course we saw the biggest story, which is really the real story, which is economic slowdown. I think there are serious problems behind that economic slowdown, and yet Beijing is taking significant efforts on the economic side, which ultimately is the engine in China that drives things, to tackle and try to corral some of these problems. These attempts that Beijing is trying to implement we'll really have to see come to pass in 2016.
Okay, well, you've mentioned it's an optimistic view. The pessimistic view relates a lot to China's military activities in the South and East China Sea. Does the saber rattling there not worry you?
There's no question that Xi Jinping has really stepped up China's aggressiveness. I mean, this comes after decades where Chinese leaders have followed their vaunted predecessor Deng Xiaoping's example of speak softly and act softly on the global stage. And in the last few years, the new Chinese president, Xi Jinping, has really turned over a new leaf. You're right, Southeast China Sea, we're seeing a lot of saber rattling. But taking a broader step, you have to put this in the context of the U.S. is pivoting toward the East. They're pivoting into East Asia, and China in some sense is also responding to a more entrenched U.S. presence.
So you're suggesting that the Americans are responsible to this?
I wouldn't say the Americans are responsible. I think that China's growing assertiveness is something that there have been benchmarks over the last decade, and that we can look back and see fairly clearly, whether it's seeing Chinese troops for the first time in overseas soil, whether it's seeing Chinese investment in Africa and Latin America, whether it's seeing their oil relationship in the Middle East growing. And China has always placed primary policy importance on its immediate borders. So what we're seeing in the South and East China Sea is really what we're seeing elsewhere, but again, the growing primacy that China gives to its immediate borders. That said, the responsibility is always going to fall squarely on Beijing. Beijing, similar to Washington and London, has its more conservative voices and its more liberal voices, and the voices that are more conservative and more militaristic are certainly gaining greater influence in Beijing in 2016.
Okay, well that leads to an interesting discussion point, which is that it seems a lot of countries in the world these days are putting economic interest ahead of perhaps strategic interest when dealing with China. And I think it's fair to say that Israel, which is a country you obviously know a lot about, is not immune to this as well. I mean, I think you've highlighted a case yourself where the Israeli government allegedly stopped an intelligence operative from actually testifying in a suicide bombing case because of a China connection in case that should harm the relationship. Should we be worried about this?
It's definitely a concern, and I would just comment upon that case, which is still in the that case is still in the courts in New York. So news will continue to emerge. What's really interesting there is that while in the recent history, the last 15 years of Israel's relations with China and the U.S., it was always Washington which was pressuring Israel, and then Israel were to cede to Washington's demand and back away from China. What you see with this very complex lawsuit happening in New York involving terror victims and money being funneled through Chinese banks by Islamic terrorism, you see that Beijing was pressuring Israeli leaders, and rather than accede to demands from Washington, Israel ceded to demands from Beijing. That's a new precedent, and that's something that we should pay a lot of attention to, because it might become something we'll look back on as the first of a new example of the relationship between the three states.
Well, that you make an interesting point. How important is the Israel-China trading relationship to both countries?
It's strong, and it's growing very strong, very quick. I mean, let's recall that China-Israel relations have a very, very brief history. In the 90s, it was all clandestine military deals. That was cut off with a sharp bang in 2000 and 2005 by Washington. And then several years followed where Israel and China kept their distance. It wasn't really until 2007 and 2009, following the global financial crisis, a China that's trying to drive innovation and the service economy domestically, a China that's, of course, trying to reinvent the Chinese economy gradually, saw Israel as a crucial partner, really, in the Middle East. Let's not forget that this is the same period when the Arab Spring took place, and therefore China realized the importance of an ally like Israel as opposed to some of its previous allies in the region.
So my final point, really, would you say, therefore, that the stability of Israel is what attracts it to China, and likewise the other way around, the fact that China is, of course, the economic force in the world brings it to Israel's forefront?
Certainly. China very much looks to strong players to form alliances. If you look in the Middle East, China's put its money on Iran, China's put its money on Saudi Arabia, and China's put its money on Egypt and Israel. They admire Israel for its stability, economic, military, political, and they see them really as a stalwart that they can work with, both on the economic, the high-tech side, and of course on the political and the military intelligence sides. From Israel's perspective, China is both a major economic and commercial opportunity, particularly, let's remember, with the relationship you have right now between Europe and Israel, and it's also potentially a burgeoning political support. There are voices in Israel, minor voices, but still from the right wing, who have been saying for years that perhaps Israel should do its own eastward pivot away from its traditional allies in the West, mostly meaning Europe, and towards new allies in the East. Not only China, but also Singapore, Korea, and perhaps Japan as well.
Sam, very interesting. I'm afraid we have to call it a halt there. Thank you for joining me from China, and thank you all at home for having joined us, and we look forward to seeing you again for another episode of Current Affairs at JTV.